September 9, 1971. Attica Correctional Facility, upstate New York. 43 people died. In 4 days. It remains the deadliest prison uprising in the history of the United States, and it has never been fully explained. 7 most feared inmates inside Attica Correctional. The full prison documentary, the full list, the shocking details, because here is what most people who know the name Attica do not know. The riot was not the story. The riot was the symptom. The real story is what was happening inside those walls for years before and years after those 4 days in September. Here is what we are going to answer today. Who were the 7 men inside Attica? Whose presence, whose psychology, whose resistance, whose sheer force of will made this institution one of the most psychologically volatile correctional facilities in American history? One of them was innocent. One of them became a published author inside his cell. One of them changed American law without a law degree. And one of them, number 1, was so feared, so organizationally powerful, that the state of New York has never fully released the documents about what he did inside those walls. Stay with me. 7 inmates, 1 prison, 1 riot that the whole world watched. But the real story was never about the riot. It was about the men who were there, before it, during it, and after it, and what they reveal about justice, power, and what happens when a system runs out of answers. Attica is waiting. Let's go inside. Before we count down to the most feared inmate Attica ever held, we need to understand something fundamental about this prison that most documentaries never address. Attica was not just a prison. It was a pressure cooker, a facility built in 1931 in the middle of upstate New York farmland, miles from the nearest city, miles from the nearest person who cared what happened inside. And by the 1960s, that pressure cooker had been turned up so high that everyone inside, inmates, officers, administrators, was living inside a system that was visibly, measurably, dangerously close to catastrophic failure. The men on this list did not create that pressure. They revealed it. Each one of them, in their own way, through their own story, held up a mirror to an institution that did not want to see its own reflection. And what the mirror showed was not just a prison with dangerous people inside. It was a society that had outsourced its most uncomfortable questions to a building in the middle of a field in upstate New York and told itself the questions were answered. They were not answered. They are still not answered. And that is why we are still talking about Attica 50 years later. Number 7. William Francis Sutton, known to every newspaper in America as Willie Sutton, known to the public by a reputation that was equal parts genuine criminal achievement and mythology, so thoroughly constructed that even Sutton himself eventually had trouble separating the two. Willie Sutton was a bank robber, not a violent one, at least not by the standards of the era he operated in. In a career spanning 3 decades, Sutton robbed an estimated 100 banks across the eastern United States for a total of approximately $2 million. $2 million, 100 banks, 3 decades. He was caught, and he escaped 3 times from 3 different maximum security facilities. Each escape more audacious than the last. Each recapture followed by a period of freedom, long enough to rob more banks and generate more headlines. But here is the detail about Willie Sutton that changes everything. The detail that most true crime summaries leave out entirely. When Willie Sutton was finally, definitively, permanently caught and sent to Attica in the early 1950s, he did not arrive as the swaggering, charming, theatrical criminal mastermind that the newspapers had created. He arrived as something far more interesting, a man who was tired, not defeated, not broken, not remorseful in the performance for the parole board sense, but genuinely, profoundly tired of the distance between who the world thought he was and who he actually was. Because here is the thing about Willie Sutton that the mythology obscured. He was not a thrill seeker. He was not a rebel. He was not a romantic criminal who robbed banks because the freedom of the act was intoxicating. He robbed banks because he was poor, because he grew up in Brooklyn in a family that could not afford the things that the world told him he was supposed to want, because the gap between what society promised and what it actually delivered to a kid from Brooklyn with no connections and no inheritance was so large that the only way he could see across it was to take a shortcut that the law had decided was not available to him. A journalist once asked Willie Sutton why he robbed banks. Sutton's reported answer became one of the most famous quotes in American criminal history. Because that's where the money is. It is a great line. It is quotable. It sounds like the answer of a man who is comfortable with what he did and amused by the question. But Sutton later said, he never actually said it, that the journalist made it up, that it sounded good, that it fit the character. The public had already decided he was. The real answer, the one Sutton gave in his own memoir, was more complicated and more honest and far less quotable. He robbed banks because he didn't know what else to do, because the legitimate world had never offered him a path that felt like it actually led somewhere, because the skills he had, the intelligence, the attention to detail, the ability to plan and adapt and execute under pressure were skills that the legitimate world was not interested in recognizing in a kid from Brooklyn without credentials. Sound familiar? We heard this story in the Alcatraz documentary. We will keep hearing it in every prison documentary until the conditions that produce it change. Inside Attica, Willie Sutton did something that surprised everyone who had built their image of him on the mythology. He became a model prisoner. He worked in the prison hospital. He was genuinely helpful. He was patient with other inmates, with the staff, with the grinding tedium of institutional life. He was, by the accounts of everyone who encountered him inside those walls, a good person to be around, which raises the question that his story always eventually raises: was the bank robber the real Willie Sutton, or was the hospital orderly? And what does it mean that a society only got access to the second version after it had locked the first version away? Willie Sutton was released from Attica in 1969. He was 68 years old. He had spent more than half his life either in prison or planning the next robbery. He spent the last years of his life in Florida, working as a bank security consultant. The man who robbed 100 banks spent his final years helping banks not get robbed. That is not a comment on the absurdity of how we use and waste human potential. Nothing is. Number 6. And now the temperature in this documentary changes, because Willie Sutton, for all the complexity of his story, was guilty. He robbed banks. He knew he robbed banks. The evidence was overwhelming, and the verdict was correct. Number 6 was not guilty. Number 6 should not have been in Attica at all. Rubin Carter, known worldwide as Hurricane, the name he earned in the ring as one of the most feared middleweight boxers of his generation, a man who had fought his way from a childhood of poverty and institutional abuse to the edge of a world championship through nothing but extraordinary physical and mental discipline. In 1966, Rubin Carter and a companion were convicted of a triple murder in a bar in Paterson, New Jersey. The evidence was contested from the beginning. Witnesses who initially identified other suspects, eyewitness testimony that changed between the initial police interviews and the courtroom, a prosecution case built on the statements of two men who were themselves facing criminal charges and who later recanted, saying they had been pressured by law enforcement into identifying Carter. Rubin Carter maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest to the moment a federal judge finally, after 19 years, agreed with him. 19 years inside Attica, inside one of the most psychologically volatile correctional environments in the United States, maintaining the position that he did not belong there, that the system had made a catastrophic error, that the life that had been taken from him, the boxing career, the freedom, the years, was taken by the same forces of racial bias and institutional failure that had shaped his entire life from childhood. Think about what that psychological position requires. Not just innocence, not just the knowledge that you did not do what the system says you did, but the sustained, daily, decade after decade, act of maintaining that position inside an environment specifically designed to make you accept the institutional definition of who you are. In prison, the system defines you by your crime, your number, your file, your conviction. Everything about the institution is built around the premise that you are here because of what you did, and the institution knows what that was. For a man who did not do it, for a man who knows with absolute certainty that the institutional premise is wrong, maintaining a coherent sense of self inside that environment requires a psychological strength that is almost impossible to overstate. Rubin Carter did not just survive Attica, He documented it. Inside his cell, he wrote his autobiography, The 16th Round, written inside Attica, and published in 1974, was not just a personal account of wrongful conviction. It was a precise, clear-eyed, psychologically sophisticated examination of what the American justice system was doing to black men in the 1960s and 1970s. It was read by people around the world. Bob Dylan wrote a song about it. Muhammad Ali visited Carter in prison. The global attention generated by Carter's story became one of the most significant public conversations about race and justice in American history, all of it originating from a cell in Attica that Carter should never have been placed in. In 1985, 19 years after his conviction, a federal judge ruled that Carter's trial had been fundamentally flawed, that the prosecution had withheld evidence, that the convictions could not stand. Rubin Carter walked out of prison, a free man. He spent the rest of his life working for the wrongfully convicted, building organizations that investigated cases like his own. He died in 2014. He never received a formal apology from the state of New Jersey. 19 years, no apology. That is not just Rubin Carter's story. That is a statement about the values of the system that took 19 years from a man it had no right to touch. Two men, two completely different relationships to guilt. Willie Sutton, guilty, tired of his own mythology, quietly useful, in a place designed to make people feel useless. Rubin Carter, innocent, refusing every day to accept the institutional story of who he was, writing his truth on the pages of a book the world eventually read. Two different wounds, the same institution, the same walls, the same system. In Act 2, we meet the men whose stories move from the personal to the political, from individual injustice to the organized, deliberate, psychologically sophisticated, collective resistance that turned Attica from a prison into a symbol. That story is next. Rubin Carter spent 19 years inside Attica for a crime he did not commit. When he walked out, the state of New Jersey never formally apologized. Willie Sutton robbed 100 banks, became a model prisoner, and spent his final years helping banks protect themselves. Two men, two completely different stories, but the same question: what does a justice system owe the people it processes, whether they are guilty or innocent? Is an apology enough? Is it even necessary? Tell me what you think below, because this question has no easy answer and I genuinely want to hear yours. Act 1 gave us two men whose stories were personal. Tired bank robber who became a hospital orderly, an innocent boxer who refused to accept the institutional definition of who he was. Two individual wounds. Act 2 is different because the three men we are about to meet were not fighting individual battles. They were fighting the system itself, not with their fists, not with violence, at least not primarily, but with ideas, with organization, with a specific, targeted, psychologically sophisticated understanding that the most dangerous thing an inmate can do inside a prison is not attack a guard. It is make the other inmates understand their own power. That understanding, that specific political awakening, is what transformed Attica from a prison into a symbol. And the three men in this act were the architects of that transformation. Number 5, Sam Melville. This is the name on this list that most people have never heard, and it is the name that, once you understand the full context, explains more about why the Attica riot happened than almost any other single figure in the institution's history. Sam Melville arrived at Attica in 1970. He was 32 years old. He was white. He was educated. He was, by every conventional measure, a person who had been given the opportunities that the American system claimed to provide. And he had looked at those opportunities, looked at the society offering them, and decided, deliberately, ideologically, with full awareness of the consequences, that he wanted no part of what was being offered. Sam Melville had been convicted of a series of bombings in New York City in 1969, federal buildings, corporate offices, institutions that Melville and the radical political movement he was part of had identified as symbols of a system they believed was irredeemably corrupt. No one was killed in Melville's bombings. That was deliberate. He wanted to damage the symbols of power, not the people who happened to be near them. He arrived at Attica carrying a political identity so fully formed, so intellectually rigorous, so genuinely committed, that the prison could not process it through its normal mechanisms. Because the normal mechanism for processing a dangerous inmate is to make them afraid. Sam Melville was not afraid. He was, in the specific, psychological sense, beyond fear, not because he was reckless, not because he was unstable, but because a person who has made a genuine, considered, fully conscious choice to sacrifice their freedom for what they believe in has already done the psychological work that fear is supposed to prevent. They have already weighed the cost. They have already paid it. The institution's primary tool of control did not work on Sam Melville. Inside Attica, Melville did what ideologically committed people always do. In constrained environments, he organized, he wrote, he talked, he connected. He found the other inmates who were ready to understand their situation, not just as personal misfortune, but as a political condition, as the predictable outcome of systems designed to produce exactly this result, for exactly this population. His letters from Attica, collected and published after his death, describe the prison with a clarity and precision that academic researchers have cited for decades. He described the racial dynamics, the economic dynamics, the deliberate use of intergroup tension as a management tool by the administration. He described in precise detail the way that a prison is not simply a place where dangerous people are kept, but a place where the social order outside the walls is reproduced and enforced with particular brutality, where the people who were poorest and most marginalized on the outside are most completely controlled on the inside. He was not wrong. The research supports him, the history supports him, and his ability to articulate those dynamics clearly enough that other inmates could recognize their own experience. In his words, that was what made him genuinely dangerous to the Attica administration. Not the bombs from 1969, not the physical threat, the clarity. Sam Melville was killed during the retaking of Attica. On September 13, 1971, he was shot by the law enforcement that Governor Nelson Rockefeller ordered into the facility after negotiations broke down. He was 33 years old. Whether he died as a revolutionary martyr or as an inmate who made catastrophically bad choices that led to catastrophic consequences is a question that people who lived through Attica are still debating. 50 years later, that unresolved debate is itself part of his legacy. Number 4. Jerome Washington. Where Sam Melville fought with ideology, Jerome Washington fought with something more precise, more targeted, more difficult for the institution to dismiss or suppress. He fought with the law itself. Jerome Washington arrived at Attica in the late 1960s. He had not gone to law school. He had no legal credentials. He had no bar admission and no right to practice in any jurisdiction. What he had was time and access to a prison library. Jerome Washington spent his years at Attica doing something that the institution had not anticipated and did not know how to respond to. He studied the law, not casually, not as a hobby, not as a way to pass the time, but with a focused, systematic, obsessive dedication of a person who has identified the one tool that the system cannot legitimately deny him and has decided to become an expert in its use. He became a jailhouse lawyer, a term that sounds informal, almost dismissive, but that represents one of the most significant grassroots legal movements in American history, because jailhouse lawyers, like Jerome Washington, did something that no external advocacy organization, no well-funded legal nonprofit, no sympathetic academic researcher could do from the outside. They were present. They were in the cells, beside the men whose rights were being violated. They heard the stories in real time. They understood the institutional dynamics from the inside. They could file grievances the same day a violation occurred. They could advise other inmates on their rights in the language of the yard, rather than the language of the law school. And they were there every single day, not because they were paid to be, not because it was their job, but because they lived there. Jerome Washington filed grievances. He drafted legal documents. He advised other inmates on their rights. He found violations in the institutional procedures of Attica and documented them with the precision of a trained attorney. Retention Bridge 4. The administration's response to Washington's legal work is one of the most revealing details in the entire Attica story. They couldn't ignore him. The grievances were real. The legal arguments were sound. They couldn't discredit him. His documentation was precise. They couldn't punish him without creating exactly the kind of documented rights violation that his work was designed to expose. So they did what institutions do when they encounter a challenge they cannot address through normal channels. They made his life as difficult as possible within the bounds of institutional rules, extra scrutiny, cell searches, minor disciplinary actions for minor infractions that would have been overlooked for other inmates, the institutional equivalent of saying, "We cannot stop you, but we can make sure you know we are watching." Washington continued anyway. His written accounts of life inside Attica, published after his release under the title Iron House, are considered one of the most important first-hand accounts of the American prison experience ever documented, not because they are dramatic, not because they are sensational, but because they are precise, because Jerome Washington brought a lawyer's eye, self-taught, relentlessly applied to the documentation of what the institution did to the people inside it, and precision, in the context of institutional power, is the most subversive tool available. Number 3, and now we reach the man who was at the center of the most significant event in Attica's history, who was there when it began, who was there during the 4 days that the world was watching, and who was there for the aftermath that the world largely did not see, and that the state of New York spent decades trying to ensure it would not have to answer for. Frank Smith, known inside the walls and eventually outside them as Big Black. Frank Smith arrived at Attica in 1969. He was a large man, physically imposing, immediately visible, the kind of presence that registers in a room before anyone has spoken. But the physical presence was not what made him significant. What made Frank Smith significant, what made him number 3 on this list, was his capacity for leadership. Not the kind of leadership that announces itself, not the kind that seeks attention or requires an audience to function, but the specific, quiet, deeply effective leadership of a person who understands what a group of people need before they know they need it, and provides it without making the provision about themselves. Inside Attica, Frank Smith became one of the key organizing figures among the inmate population. Not the only one, not the most ideologically articulate, that was Melville. Not the most legally sophisticated, that was Washington, but the most present, the most trusted, the person that other inmates turned to, not because he had the most impressive credentials, but because he had the most reliable judgment. When the Attica Uprising began, on September 9, 1971, Frank Smith became one of the key inmate leaders in D.R. during the 4 days of negotiation, 4 days in which the inmates held correctional officers as hostages while attempting to negotiate genuine reforms to the conditions they were living under. Frank Smith was one of the voices most consistently working toward a peaceful resolution. He understood what the administration apparently did not, that the inmates did not want war. They wanted toilets that worked. They wanted adequate food. They wanted medical care that met basic standards. They wanted to be treated as human beings rather than as problems to be managed. When Governor Rockefeller ordered the retaking of Attica on September 13, 1971, when state police and corrections officers entered D.R. with live ammunition, the negotiated resolution that Frank Smith and the other inmate leaders had been working toward ended in 4 minutes of extraordinary violence. 29 inmates were killed. 10 correctional officer hostages were also killed. All of them, the official autopsy confirmed, by the gunfire of the state's own forces, not by the inmates, by the state. Frank Smith survived, and what happened to him in the hours and days after the retaking is the part of the Attica story that the state of New York spent the next 50 years trying to suppress. In the aftermath of the retaking, surviving inmates were subjected to documented acts of retaliatory abuse by correctional officers. Frank Smith was specifically targeted. He was forced to lie on a metal table while correctional officers subjected him to hours of physical abuse. He later filed suit against the state of New York. The legal case took 27 years. In 2000, 29 years after the riot, the state of New York reached a settlement with surviving Attica inmates of $12 million. Frank Smith received a portion of that settlement. He said it was not about the money. It was about the record, about the official, documented, legally established acknowledgement that what the state did to the men inside Attica after the retaking not during the riot, after, was wrong, that the state had been the perpetrator, not just the authority. Frank Big Black Smith died in 2004. He spent the years between his release from Attica and his death doing what survivors of institutional violence sometimes do when they have the strength that survival requires. He told the story every time to everyone who would listen because he understood something that institutions always understand and always work against. A story that is told cannot be made untrue. 3 men, 3 completely different weapons. Sam Melville, ideology. Jerome Washington, the law. Frank Big Black Smith, presence, leadership, and testimony. 3 different ways of being dangerous inside a system that expected danger to come only in the forms it already knew how to handle. Did not know how to handle a man who was not afraid. Did not know how to handle a man who knew the law better than the people enforcing it, and it did not know how to handle a man who survived what it did to him and then spent the rest of his life making sure the story was told. In Act 3, we reach number 2, and the most important question this entire documentary has been building toward: what happens to the people who witness what Attica witnessed and are then asked to go back to normal life as if they didn't? That story and the final reveal of number 1 is next. Sam Melville was killed during the retaking of Attica. The official autopsy confirmed that the 10 correctional officers who also died were killed by state gunfire, not by inmates. Governor Rockefeller ordered the retaking and never faced criminal charges. Frank Big Black Smith waited 29 years for a settlement that could never give back what was taken. Here is the question: when a state causes the deaths of its own officers and its own inmates during a prison retaking, and then spends decades suppressing the evidence, who is responsible? The governor who gave the order? The system that created the conditions? The society that looked away? Leave your answer below. This is one of the most important unresolved questions in American history. We are down to 2, and before we get to number 1, before we reach the most feared inmate in Attica's history, I need you to understand something about scars. Not physical scars, institutional scars, the kind that do not show on the body, the kind that live in the way a person enters a room, in the way they sit with their back to the wall, in the way they flinch at sounds that other people do not even register. Every person who spent significant time inside Attica, in the era we are examining, every inmate, every correctional officer, every administrator who walked those corridors during those years carries a version of that scar. But number 2 on this list carries something more specific, more documented, more publicly visible, because number 2 did not just survive what Attica did to him. He made the scar into a story, and the story became one of the most important documents in the entire history of American correctional literature. Number 2, the man who wrote his way out of the darkness. Before we introduce number 2, I need to pause, because this documentary has a responsibility that most true crime content does not take seriously enough. The responsibility to remember that Attica was not only a story about inmates, it was a story about everyone inside those walls. Eddie Byrne was a correctional officer at Attica. He was one of the officers taken hostage during the 4 days of the 1971 uprising. He survived, but what survival meant for Eddie Byrne and for the families of the 10 officers who did not survive is a part of the Attica story that is almost never told with the same depth and humanity as the inmate narratives. Think about what it means to be a correctional officer at Attica in 1971. You are not the governor. You are not the administrator who set the policies. You are not the politician who cut the budgets that produced the conditions that made the riot inevitable. You are a person from a working class family in upstate New York who took a job that paid a stable salary and offered a pension. You walked into a facility every shift that you and everyone around you knew was dangerously under-resourced, dangerously overcrowded, and dangerously close to catastrophic failure. And when that failure came, when the institution that was supposed to protect you proved that it could not, you were the one who paid the price, not the governor, not the administrator. The families of the 10 officers who died at Attica in September 1971 waited more than 30 years for the state of New York to formally acknowledge what had happened. They received a settlement of $12 million shared between the families of officers and the surviving inmates. The same settlement, the same fund, victims and survivors, of the same event, on different sides, of the same institutional failure, receiving compensation from the same pool of money. That detail, the shared settlement, is perhaps the most precise summary of what Attica was, an institution that failed. Everyone inside it, officers and inmates alike, different wounds, the same source. Number 2, Richard X. Clark. Richard Clark arrived at Attica in the late 1960s. He was young. He was black. He was, by his own account, in the writings he would eventually produce, a person whose entire pre-prison life had been a preparation for exactly the kind of institutional failure that Attica represented, without him ever knowing that preparation was happening. Poverty, under-resourced schools, a justice system that processed him as a problem to be managed rather than a person to be understood. The pipeline that delivered him to Attica was not accidental. It was the predictable output of a set of conditions that had been producing the same result for the same population for generations. Inside Attica, Richard Clark did what several of the men on this list did. He educated himself, but the education that Richard Clark pursued was different from Jerome Washington's legal studies or Robert Stroud's ornithological research. Richard Clark educated himself in the one subject that the institution was most afraid of him, understanding himself, his own history, his own community's history, the history of the systems that had produced the conditions he was living inside. He studied African American history and political thought with the same focused intensity that Washington brought to the law and that Melville brought to ideology. He found in that study something that the institution could not take from him, no matter what it did to his physical circumstances. An explanation, not an excuse, not a justification for anything, but an explanation, a coherent, historically grounded, intellectually rigorous account of how the world that produced him worked. And that explanation did for Richard Clark's psychology what explanation always does for a mind that has been living inside confusion and pain. It gave the pain a shape, and a pain with a shape is a pain that can be examined, understood, survived. During the 4 days of the Attica Uprising, Richard Clark was one of the inmate voices, consistently working toward a nonviolent resolution. He understood what the cameras outside the walls did not show clearly, that the men in the yard were not primarily interested in violence. They were interested in change. They wanted to be heard by people with the power to respond. They wanted the governor to come to the yard, not as a surrender, not as a humiliation, but as an acknowledgement that the men inside were human beings whose grievances were real and whose voices deserved a direct response. Rockefeller refused to come, and that refusal, that specific, deliberate, politically calculated decision to not walk into that yard and face the men inside is something that Richard Clark wrote about with devastating clarity in the years that followed. He did not write with rage. He wrote with the specific, devastating precision of a person who has understood something completely and knows that understanding it completely is the most powerful response available. The governor did not come to the yard because coming to the yard would have meant treating the men inside as people worth coming for, and the system that produced Attica was not built on that premise. After his release from Attica, Richard Clark spent years doing what survivors of institutional violence sometimes do when they have both the intellectual tools and the psychological strength to do it. He documented it. His account of Attica, The Brothers of Attica, is one of the most important primary source documents in the historical record of what happened inside those walls, not because it is the most dramatic account, not because it contains the most shocking revelations, but because it is the account of a person who was present and who had the analytical framework to understand what presence meant. There is a specific kind of historical document that scholars call a witness account, not a legal testimony, not a journalistic report, a witness account, the record produced by a person who was present at a significant event and who has subsequently developed the understanding necessary to explain not just what happened, but why it happened and what it means that it happened. Richard Clark's account is that kind of document, and its existence, its presence in the historical record, is one of the reasons that Attica cannot be fully suppressed or revised by the institutional narrative that the state of New York is spent decades trying to construct, because the witness account is there, precise, grounded, humanly real. It cannot be made untrue. The scar that Attica left on Richard Clark became, in his hands, not a wound that diminished him, but a credential that authorized him to speak about something that people who were not there could not fully understand. And he used that credential for the rest of his life, in classrooms, in community spaces, in the historical record, speaking about Attica, not as a horror story to be consumed, but as a case study to be understood and eventually learned from. But Richard Clark's scar was only one of the scars that Attica produced, and this documentary would be dishonest if it focused only on the inmate experience without returning to the people on the other side of the institutional equation, the correctional officers who worked at Attica before, during, and after 1971 carry their own version of the scar. Research on correctional officers who worked in facilities where major uprisings occurred documents rates of post-traumatic stress comparable to combat veterans, the specific combination of being taken hostage, of watching colleagues die, of discovering afterward that the official story about how those colleagues died was not the true story. That combination produces a psychological wound of extraordinary complexity, because the officers who survived the retaking had to process not just the trauma of what they had experienced, they had to process the institutional betrayal of discovering that their colleagues had not been killed by the people the institution had told them to fear. They had been killed by the state's own response to the situation, by the decision made in an office in Albany by a man who was not in the yard. That discovery, that specific, documented, officially confirmed fact does not simplify the officer's grief, complicates it, because it means that the grief cannot be directed cleanly at the inmates who started the uprising. It has to be directed at something more diffuse, more institutional, more difficult to name: the system, the decision, the governor, the political calculation that valued the appearance of strength more than the lives of the people inside, officers and inmates. The scar is on both sides of the cell door, beyond the individuals, beyond the inmates and the officers and the families. There are the communities. Attica sits in Wyoming County, upstate New York, a rural community where the prison is one of the largest employers, where the families of correctional officers and the families of inmates sometimes live in the same small towns, shop at the same stores, send their children to the same schools, living for decades inside the same geography, the same upstate New York landscape as the event that divided them. The community around Attica has been living with the weight of September 1971 for more than 50 years. It is a weight that does not diminish simply because time passes, because the questions that Attica raised have not been answered, not fully, not honestly, not in the way that answers, rather than settlements, actually require. The governor who ordered the retaking died in 1979 without facing criminal charges for the decisions he made. In September 1971, the full documentary record of what happened inside Attica during and after the retaking has still not been completely released by the state of New York. The men who were abused in the aftermath received financial compensation 29 years later, financial compensation for what was done to them in a facility managed by the state, by officers acting in the name of the state, following orders given by the state. The money acknowledged that something wrong happened, did not name who was responsible, did not produce a single criminal conviction, did not change the fundamental conditions that produced the riot in the first place, because those conditions, overcrowding, understaffing, inadequate medical care, the systematic denial of basic human dignity to the people inside, were not specific to Attica. They were not specific to 1971. They exist today in facilities across the country. The scar of Attica is not a historical artifact. It is a living wound. Number 2, Richard X. Clark, a man who arrived at Attica as a product of systems that had never fully seen him, as a person who used the years inside to understand those systems completely, who survived the uprising and the retaking and the aftermath, and who spent the rest of his life ensuring that the story was told accurately, with all of its complexity, all of its moral weight, all of its unresolved questions intact. One remains Number 1. The most feared inmate in Attica's history. A man whose story connects everything we have examined in this documentary into a single, coherent, devastating case study in what happens when a society builds a system designed to disappear people, and one of those people refuses to disappear. That story is next, and it will change how you think about Attica completely. The families of the 10 correctional officers killed at Attica received compensation from the same settlement fund as the surviving inmates because the state failed all of them. The officers were killed by state gunfire, not by inmates. The inmates were abused in the aftermath by state officers. Both groups waited nearly 30 years for acknowledgement. Here is the question that I think about every time I examine Attica. When an institution fails the people inside it, on both sides of the cell door, who is the institution actually serving? Is it serving the public? Is it serving justice? Or is it serving itself? Leave your most honest answer below. 6 names, 6 stories, 6 completely different relationships to the same institution. Willie Sutton, the tired bank robber, who became quietly useful inside the walls of a place that had no idea what to do with him. Reuben Carter, the innocent man who refused for 19 years to let the institution define him by a crime he did not commit. Sam Melville, the ideological threat who made the administration afraid, not with violence, but with clarity. Jerome Washington, the jailhouse lawyer who turned the institution's own rules against it. Frank Big Black Smith, the leader who worked toward peace in the 4 days the world was watching, and then spent 30 years ensuring that what happened after the cameras left was part of the record. Richard X Clark, the witness whose account documented everything the state wanted forgotten. 6 men, 6 scars, and 1 remaining. Number 1. The name on this list that connects all 6 stories into a single, coherent, devastating truth about what Attica was and what it represents in the history of American justice. His name was George Jackson. Wait, you may recognize that name from a different context. George Jackson was the founder of the Black Guerrilla family, the same George Jackson whose assassination at San Quentin in August 1971 we examined in the Mexican Mafia documentary. That connection is not accidental, because the story of George Jackson and Attica is the story of how one man's ideas, generated inside a California prison, transmitted through published writing to prisoners across the country, helped catalyze the political awakening that made the Attica Uprising not just a riot, but a revolution in how America understood its own prisons. But George Jackson is not number 1 on the Attica list. He is the context for number 1. Number 1 is the man whose story has been building since the first second of this documentary. The man whose documents the state of New York has still not fully released. The man whose presence at Attica during and after the uprising generated more institutional fear, more governmental anxiety, more sustained official attention than any other single inmate in the facility's history. His name was L.D. Barkley, Elliot James Barkley, known inside Attica and eventually to the world as L.D. Barkley. He was 21 years old when the Attica Uprising began. On September 9, 1971, 21, he had been incarcerated for violating his parole on a robbery conviction. Not murder, not organized crime, not the kind of crime that the mythology of dangerous inmates typically centers. A parole violation. He was 21 years old, inside Attica for a parole violation, with a release date that was less than 3 months away. Retention Bridge 1. Think about that for a moment. L.D. Barkley had less than 90 days until his scheduled release when the uprising began. Less than 90 days until he walked out of those walls and began whatever came next. He could have kept his head down. He could have waited. He could have done what anyone with 90 days left would be tempted to do. Stay quiet. Stay safe. Go home. He did not do that because L.D. Barkley had spent his time at Attica doing what Richard Clark, what Jerome Washington, what Sam Melville had also done, educating himself, reading, thinking, building a framework for understanding the conditions he was living inside. And the framework he built told him something that 90 days of patience could not make him ignore. That what was happening at Attica was wrong. Not just inconvenient, not just uncomfortable, fundamentally, documentably, historically wrong. And that wrong was not going to fix itself while he waited in his cell for his release date. On September 9, 1971, the inmates of Attica took control of D-Yard. In the hours that followed, as the world outside began to understand what was happening, a group of journalists and observers were allowed into the yard to witness the negotiations. And it was in that yard, in front of those cameras, in front of the world, that L.D. Barkley stood up and spoke. The speech that L.D. Barkley delivered in D-Yard on September 9, 1971 is one of the most extraordinary pieces of spontaneous oratory in American history, not because it was polished, not because it was scripted, but because it was true and clear, direct, grade 6 language that anyone could understand. The same standard we have applied to this entire documentary. L.D. Barkley told the world what Attica was. He spoke about the conditions, the food, the medical care, the racial dynamics, the systematic denial of basic human dignity. He spoke about what it meant to be a human being inside an institution that had decided you were not fully one. And he spoke about what the men in that yard actually wanted. Not revenge, not violence, not the destruction of the institution. Humanity, the specific, modest, entirely reasonable demand to be treated as human beings by the institution that held them. The speech was broadcast. It was heard. It became, in the days and weeks that followed, one of the most cited pieces of inmate testimony in the history of American correctional reform. And then, 4 days later, Governor Rockefeller ordered the retaking. And L.D. Barkley, 21 years old, 90 days from release, the voice that had told the world what Attica was killed, shot during the retaking. On September 13, 1971, he did not survive to walk through the gate he was so close to reaching. He did not get the 90 days. He did not get to find out what came after Attica. He was 21 years old, and in the specific, documentable way that some deaths become more than individual losses, become symbols, become turning points, become the moment that a story shifts from being about one person to being about everything that produced them. L.D. Barkley's death became Attica. Every inmate on this list was feared for a reason. Willie Sutton, because he always found the exit. Reuben Carter, because innocence inside prison is the most destabilizing force an institution can contain. Sam Melville, because ideology that cannot be addressed by fear cannot be managed. Jerome Washington, because legal precision turns the institution's rules against itself. Frank Big Black Smith, because leadership that works through trust rather than force cannot be dismantled by removing the leader. Richard X. Clarke, because a witness who writes it down cannot be silenced after the fact. L.D. Barkley was feared for a reason that contains all of these and exceeds them. He was feared because he was 21 years old, 90 days from freedom, with everything to lose, and he stood up anyway. That specific combination, proximity to freedom, full awareness of the cost, and the decision to speak regardless, is the most psychologically threatening thing a system of control can encounter, because the entire architecture of institutional power rests on a single premise, that people will prioritize their own safety and their own future over collective action, that the rational calculation, keep your head down, do your time, go home, will always win over the irrational one, stand up, risk everything for something bigger than yourself. L.D. Barkley made the irrational calculation with 90 days left, with his own future almost within reach, and that choice, that specific, documented, historically witnessed choice, is what made him the most feared inmate in Attica's history, not because of what he had done, but because of what he showed was possible. That a 21-year-old with 90 days left and everything to lose could stand in a yard and tell the truth to the world and be heard. Attica Correctional Facility is still open, still operates as a maximum security correctional facility in Wyoming County, upstate New York. The walls are the same walls. The yard is the same yard. The conditions inside have changed, meaningfully in some ways, insufficiently in others. The 1971 Uprising produced genuine reforms in some areas of New York State correctional policy, improved grievance procedures, some medical care improvements, incremental changes to the most egregious of the conditions that the inmates had identified in their demands. But the fundamental question that Attica raised, the question that L.D. Barkley articulated more clearly than anyone else in that yard, has not been answered. What do we owe the people we decide to remove. From society? Not what do we owe them. Legally, not what do we owe them. As a matter of constitutional minimum, but what do we owe them? Morally? As human beings, as members of the same species, as people who, regardless of what they did, or are alleged to have done, remain people. Attica answered that question, with 43 deaths and 50 years of suppressed documents and a settlement that acknowledged wrong, without naming the wrongdoers. That is not an answer. It is an avoidance, and the avoidance is still ongoing. 7 inmates, 1 prison, 1 uprising. But look at what these 7 stories, taken together, actually show us. They show us a bank robber whose skills were never offered a legitimate outlet, an innocent man whose wrongful conviction went unremedied for 19 years, an ideological thinker whose analysis of the institution was accurate enough to be threatening, a self-taught lawyer whose legal precision the institution could not refute, a leader whose trust-based authority survived every attempt to break it, a witness whose documentation outlasted the institutional narrative, and a 21-year-old with 90 days left who stood up anyway. What these 7 stories have in common is not crime, it is not danger, at least not in the way the institution defined danger. What they have in common is intelligence directed at the wrong targets by a society that never offered them the right ones. Willie Sutton's planning intelligence could have built a company. Reuben Carter's discipline was already building something extraordinary, a boxing career, a life before the system interrupted it. Sam Melville's analytical mind could have been in a university. Jerome Washington's legal precision could have been in a courtroom on the other side of the bar. Frank Smith's leadership could have been in a boardroom or a city council. Richard Clark's witness intelligence could have been in a history department. And L.D. Barclay's oratorical gift, the ability to stand in front of a hostile audience and make them feel the truth of what you are saying, is one of the rarest and most valuable human capacities that exists. It could have been anything, anywhere, for anyone. Instead, it was spent in a yard in upstate New York in September 1971, and then silenced 4 days later. That is the real cost of Attica, not the 43 deaths, though those are real and irreplaceable, but the decades of human potential that the pipeline processed and discarded before the names ever appeared on a list like this one. Attica closed its chapter on 1971. A long time ago, the lawyers settled. The documents were partially released. The reforms were partially implemented. The survivors aged. Some died. But the story did not close, because the conditions that produced Attica were not specific to Attica. They were not specific to 1971. They are present today in correctional facilities across the United States, across the United Kingdom, across every country that has decided that removing people from society into institutions is an answer to the questions that produced those people in the first place. Those questions are not answered by buildings. They are not answered by settlements. They are not answered by documentaries, however carefully made. They are answered by the choices a society makes before a person ever reaches a gate, like Attica's, by the schools it funds, by the opportunities it creates, by the gaps it closes or leaves open, by the specific, daily, unglamorous, politically difficult work of building a world in which a 21-year-old with extraordinary gifts is offered something better than a choice between a parole violation and a D-yard. In upstate New York, L.D. Barclay deserved better. So did all 7, and so do the people inside the facilities we are building right now, whose names we do not yet know. This has been 7 most feared inmates inside Attica Correctional. The full list, the shocking details, full documentary. This changed what you thought you knew about Attica. Share it with someone who thinks the story ended in 1971. It didn't. It is still going. Subscribe. The next story is waiting. L.D. Barclay was 21 years old, 90 days from release, with everything to lose. He stood up in that yard and spoke anyway. He was killed 4 days later. The governor who ordered the retaking never faced charges. The documents are still not fully released. And the conditions Barclay described in his speech, the overcrowding, the inadequate medical care, the systematic denial of dignity, exist in American correctional facilities right now, today in 2024. So here is the question I want you to sit with and answer honestly in the comments. If a 21-year-old with 90 days left could see clearly enough to stand up and describe exactly what was wrong, why couldn't the system that built the institution see it too? And more importantly, why can't we see it now? Leave your most honest answer below. I read every single one.